Hello, students. Well, one of the themes of the course so far has been um, how Americans really love to see things in writing. We're a very practical people. We like to have things in black and white. We like to know our rights. We like to know our duties. And in the English colonies, typically you would have one or more written documents that served as the foundation of government in that colony. For example, the Mayflower Compact for the Plymouth colony. It's an American tradition, this reliance on fundamental written documents. And the most important one of all, of course, is the United States Constitution, which is the most fundamental law of our land to this day. So, in this lecture, we're going to discuss how the Constitution came into being. Now, of course, you know that the Constitution was not the first framework for the United States government. That honor belongs to the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation, after they were finally passed in 1781, proved to have a lot of drawbacks. One of them was that under the Articles, Congress had very limited powers. The national government under the Articles was very small, very weak compared to the state governments. In fact, the federal Congress under the Articles of Confederation was not even allowed to tax the people. Now, you can understand, since Americans had just fought a lengthy war, which was really a tax revolt, trying to prevent taxation by the British government, you can understand why they might be leery of giving Congress this power. Still, Congress's inability to tax made it very difficult for them to function because, for example, the federal government had gone into debt greatly in order to fight the American Revolution. There was a huge war debt, and Congress was unable to liquidate that debt because it could not impose taxes. And that in turn really hurt Americans' credit rating, so that foreign countries were unwilling to lend the United States any money under the Articles of Confederation. Also, during the period of the Articles, America ran a huge trade deficit. Those of you who are business majors will know what that means. It means that you import more goods from other countries than you export goods to other countries. And so Americans were importing goods from Europe, but they were not exporting enough goods to really make up for that. So what little gold and silver was present in America was flowing out of the country to pay for those goods. Furthermore, the states also had a problem paying their debts. Now, the state legislatures could tax the people in the states. However, many of the states had also run up massive war debts, and the economy was not really strong enough for them to collect enough taxes to pay off those debts. And in this situation, there were two basic approaches that the states took to try to solve that problem. In some states, the state legislatures got the bright idea, hey, let's just print up a whole bunch of paper money and use that to pay off the debts. And of course, the debt holders were very infuriated when they were paid off with paper money that really was not worth the paper it was printed on. Other states, however, decided to be more responsible than that, and these states included Virginia and especially Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, the General Court decided to pay off all of the war debt, and in order to achieve that, they imposed very high taxes on the people of Massachusetts, and the taxes had to be paid in gold, hard money. Now, that was a real hardship for the people of Massachusetts, especially for the poorer farmers in the western part of the state. And as I hope you realize from previous lectures in this course, for the people of Massachusetts, when they felt they were being taxed too heavily and mistreated by the government, what did they do? Well, of course, they rebelled. And a rebellion broke out in 1786 in western Massachusetts. One of the ringleaders of the rebellion was a man named Daniel Shays, so this event became known as Shays' Rebellion. And it lasted into the following year, 1787. Really, Shays' Rebellion didn't amount to much. Basically, the rebels took over some courthouses, tried to prevent the taxes from being collected. Eventually, the governor of Massachusetts called up the militia and crushed the rebellion. But even though Shays' Rebellion did not have very dramatic effects within Massachusetts, it caused a lot of discussion and a lot of concern throughout the new American Republic. Some leaders really liked the fact that the people of Massachusetts had rebelled. One of those leaders was Thomas Jefferson, who wrote to a friend these words, quote, "God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." End quote. So Jefferson was basically saying, hey, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The people should rise up and hold their leaders accountable. And in fact, Jefferson said that this should happen approximately every 20 years. Wow. So that was a strong statement of support for the rebels. However, other important American leaders were not quite so gung-ho about Shays' Rebellion. One of these political figures who was very concerned about Shays' Rebellion was James Madison, who was also from Virginia. Madison is a really fascinating character. Later, he would become the fourth president of the United States immediately after Jefferson. He was about 5 feet 1 inch tall. He was married to an older woman named Dolly Madison, who it was said completely dominated him. He had migraines and other health problems throughout his life, but James Madison was really a political genius. He had studied at Princeton University, and he was a great and very, very important political thinker. Well, Madison wrote to one of his friends that he deplored, that is, he hated, quote, the late turbulent scenes in Massachusetts, end quote. Madison was afraid that Shays' Rebellion was a sign that the new nation was coming apart before it had even really gotten started. And so he began to think about ways to fix the problems with the Articles of Confederation. Madison blamed the turmoil in Massachusetts on the weak federal government created by the Articles, and he got a chance to promote his ideas in September of 1786 when he was a delegate to a trade conference between the various states in the city of Annapolis, Maryland. And while in Annapolis, Madison started talking to the other delegates and recommending that a new convention be called to revise the Articles of Confederation. And that idea really got some traction, so that in May 1787, all of the states except Rhode Island, they were they were always the oddballs, but all the other states sent delegates to a convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which became the Constitutional Convention. Because quickly the delegates realized that it was not going to be enough to just tweak the articles. They really had to reboot and start over completely and draft a new document the Constitution. Most of what we know about the Constitutional Convention, we know because Madison attended every day and he took very detailed notes on what everybody said and how all the votes went. And Madison's notes were published later after his death in 1840. And so, because of this and because of the important role he played at the convention, Madison has become known as the father of the Constitution. Well, there were many issues that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had to settle. One of them was, what would the legislative branch of the federal government look like? Excuse me. There were two different plans concerning this. One was put forth by the larger, more populated states under the leadership of Virginia. Virginia suggested that the federal legislature have two houses, and that membership in both of the houses should be based on population. In other words, the larger states, like Virginia, would have more delegates in both the lower house and the upper house of Congress. So obviously that would really have favored the more populated states. Well, clearly the smaller states, the less populated states, did not like that idea, and led by New Jersey, they came up with their own plan. Under the New Jersey plan, Congress would have had only one house, and within that, what we call unicameral legislature, one house legislature, each state would have had only one vote. So the large states like Massachusetts and Virginia would have one vote. The small states like New Jersey and at that time Georgia would have one vote. Everybody, each state would be equal no matter what their population was, which obviously favored the smaller states. And if that plan sounds familiar, it's because that is exactly how the federal Congress was organized under the Articles of Confederation. One house, each state having one vote. Well, I'm sure you're aware of the compromise that was finally reached between the two plans. So yes, we do have a two-house legislature. The lower house, the House of Representatives, is apportioned based on population. So in the House of Representatives, best I recall, California, the most populated state, has 54 representatives, while Wyoming, the least populated state, has just one. Georgia is in between with 14 representatives. The Senate, however, the upper house of the federal Congress, has, well, currently 100 members, each state having 2 senators, no matter how large or how small the state is. So California has 2 senators, New York has 2 senators, Georgia has 2 senators, Rhode Island has 2 senators, Wyoming has 2 senators. So you see how the Constitutional Convention really balanced out the concerns of the large states and the small states by creating the system as we know it today. Another very controversial mechanism that was created by the Constitutional Convention has to do with how we elect the President of the United States. The convention created the Electoral College, which has been very much a subject of discussion in recent years, starting with the election of 2000 when George W. Bush defeated Albert Gore, although he got fewer popular votes, and continuing in 2016 when Donald J. Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, even though she won many more votes, popular votes, individual votes, than he did. And the reason is that under the Electoral College system, we do not vote as individuals, we vote as citizens of our state. And the votes are counted collectively within each state, so that whoever wins the state wins that state's electoral votes. And a state has as many electoral votes as it has representatives plus senators. So California has 56, Georgia has 16, Wyoming has 3. And the net effect, I believe, of this system is to give a small advantage to the smaller states. That's how ex-President Trump was able to win in 2016, because the red states, the Republican states, many of them are the less populated states in the Great Plains and the Midwest and so forth. So it just gave a slight boost to those smaller states. Well, if we were in an actual classroom right now, I would ask you all your opinions about this, and there probably would be some pretty hot debate on the subject of the Electoral College. Some people think it's obsolete. Other people defend it because it forces presidential candidates to campaign throughout the country rather than in just a few heavily populated states. But whether you like it or hate it, it is the law of the land. Another area in which the convention had to compromise was slavery. Now, it's very interesting that if you read the Constitution from beginning to end, you will not find the word slave or slavery in it, which gives you a sense, I think, of how much the Founding Fathers were embarrassed by the institution of slavery, and in fact that they knew it was wrong. But they had to deal with it because it was obviously a bone of contention between the South and the North. So there are actually 3 provisions of the original Constitution that have to do with slavery. But the language that's used, they use kind of waffle words to get around having to actually say slavery. The first clause said that the slave trade from Africa could be abolished by Congress in the year 1808. And in fact, that is what happened. In 1808, the United States Congress banned any further importation of human beings as slaves from Africa. And so, at least officially, the slave trade from Africa ended in that year. The second provision is the Fugitive Slave Clause, which said that anybody bound to service or labor in one state who escaped and went to another state had to be returned to the original state. In other words, had to be captured and returned to his or her master to continue being a slave. That's the Fugitive Slave Clause. The third provision is the most infamous of the 3 provisions. It's known as the 3/5 Compromise, and this had to do with representation in the House of Representatives. Now, the southern states wanted all the slaves to be counted as population for their state, because obviously that would give them more representatives in the House. The northern states, which many of which had abolished slavery or were in the process of abolishing slavery, said, wait a minute, we don't think the South should get any additional population from the slaves. The slaves are not citizens. They're not allowed to vote in the South. So why should they be counted as population? And so there was a deadlock. Well, the compromise that was reached said that for purposes of representation, each person held to labor would be counted essentially as 3/5 of a person. So, for example, if there were 10,000 slaves in Delaware, then 6,000 would be added to the population of Delaware, 3/5 of the total number of slaves. But obviously, this idea that somehow slaves were less than a full person, that they were worth 3/5 of a human being, is why this clause has been seen as being so dehumanizing and so unethical. Well, after all of these situations were discussed and after all the compromises were reached and the document was finally completed, the delegates realized that it was a little bit dry to read, and it is. If you try to read the Constitution, it's actually pretty dull. And so they realized that they needed to add an introduction to try to express what the Constitution was all about in a way that people could understand and get behind. And so they got a delegate from New York named Gouverneur Morris to write what we call the preamble to the Constitution. By the way, Morris, too, was a very interesting character. He had lost a leg in a carriage accident as a young man, so he actually had a wooden leg, but in spite of that, he was considered the greatest ladies' man among the founding fathers, and his exploits romantically were kind of legendary. But in any case, here's what Gouverneur Morris came up with. You see it on the screen there. Let's break this down a little bit. To my mind, the most important words in the Constitution are the first three words of the preamble. We, the people. In other words, what Morris was saying was that the actual rulers of the country are we, the people. That is, you and me. Not the government, not the federal government, not the states, not the elite people or the well-educated people or the wealthy people or the upper 1% of the people, but we the people, all the people of the United States are the sovereigns. We are the rulers of this nation, and that is something we should never forget. In order to form a more perfect union, well, I think Morris probably had Shays' Rebellion in mind with that, and also with the next couple of clauses: establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. In other words, trying to create a framework of government that would lead to a peaceful and orderly and harmonious society. Provide for the common defense, that is, Army, Navy, protecting the people. Promote the general welfare. This is actually a very important clause, I think. By general welfare, Morris is simply talking about the common good of the whole people, the whole community, as something that's very important. In America, I think we tend to think about our individual rights a lot. You know, don't we? I mean, there are lots of times we'll say, I have a right to be here, I have a right to do this, or I have a right to do that. You know, one guy will say, I have a right to smoke, and someone else will say, no, because I have a right to clean air, you know, and things like that. We're very serious about our rights, aren't we? And they are important, don't get me wrong. But Morris is saying here, and the constitutional conventioneers are saying here, that the common good of the whole people is also important, and there are times, I think they're suggesting, when individuals have to sacrifice their rights for the sake of the good of the whole, the general welfare, the common good. And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And if you look up that word posterity, you'll find out that it means your descendants, the people that come after you, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. In other words, the delegates were saying that this Constitution was not just to benefit their generation, it was for all of us who would come after in this country, all future generations. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Well, one of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention was Benjamin Franklin, who was in his 80s by this point and in poor health. But on the last day of the convention, Franklin made a short speech. And in the speech, he referenced the chair which was used during the convention by the president of the convention, who was George Washington. And you can actually see this chair if you go to the Constitution Museum in Philadelphia, which is a fantastic museum if you ever get a chance to go there. And you notice on the back of the chair, there's an emblem at the top. It's a sun, half of a sun, looking like it has a little face there. And Franklin said these words, quote, "I have often and often in the course of the session looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." End quote. In other words, Franklin was saying he thought the convention had done a good job, that they had produced such a good document as the foundation of our society, that the future was bright. In other words, America was not on the way down, it was not setting, it was on the rise, and that there was a lot to hope for from this Constitution. And also there's a story that as Franklin left the convention hall, a woman actually stopped him in the street and said, "Well, Mr. Franklin, what sort of government have you given us? A monarchy, an aristocracy, a democracy?" And Franklin looked at her and said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Something for us to think about. Well, when the Constitution finished being drafted by the Constitutional Convention, that was not the end of it. It did not automatically become the law of the land. It had to be ratified, and it was sent to the states for ratification. And different states used different methods. Many of them elected a special convention, which was charged with the task of determining whether that state would ratify the Constitution or not. So there was a lot of political discussion going on in the various states about the Constitution, whether or not to accept it. People who were in favor of the Constitution were known as Federalists. And in New York State, three of the most prominent American Federalists got together to start publishing articles in newspapers to try to get New York to ratify the Constitution. And those three were Alexander Hamilton, who we'll talk a lot about in the lecture on the federal period, John Jay, they were both from New York, and James Madison from Virginia also joined in. And these articles were eventually collected into a volume called the Federalist Papers, which is considered to be the greatest book of political science ever produced by Americans. And so some leaders used their influence to promote ratification of the Constitution. However, there were many Americans who were doubtful about the Constitution. It made them nervous for many reasons, and these people were known as anti-federalists. What were some of the criticisms that they made? Well, many anti-federalists thought that the Constitution would make the federal government too powerful, that the federal government would overwhelm and eventually replace the state governments. And actually, if you look at American history over the last nearly 250 years, you see that in fact the power of the federal government has grown dramatically relative to the state governments. So perhaps they were onto something there. But one of the main concerns that Anti-Federalists had was the lack of protection for individual rights in the Constitution. And you have to understand that when the Constitution left the convention, it did not include the Bill of Rights that we're all familiar with today. The Bill of Rights is actually the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and those were added later after the government actually got started. So during the ratification process, there was no Bill of Rights, and there were very few places in the Constitution that actually mentioned or protected individual rights and liberties. And so many anti-federalists said, look, we might be willing to ratify, but we want to see a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. Well, the Constitution itself says that it would become law when 9 out of the 13 states ratified it, and the 9th state to ratify was actually New Hampshire on June 21st, 1788. So officially it became the law of the land. However, some of the most important states had not yet ratified, including Virginia and New York. And in both of those states, they did ratify the Constitution, but in both cases they said, we are ratifying on the condition that amendments will be added clarifying the rights of the people. And so when the federal government went into operation and the first Congress met, that became the first order of business, to draft a Bill of Rights to add that to the Constitution. And of course that is what happened. There were 2 states actually who did not ratify the Constitution until the federal government had actually gotten underway. President Washington had been elected, Congress was meeting, and those 2 states were North Carolina and, of course, Rhode Island. They were always the odd man out. But when those 2 states saw that this really was happening and that the Constitution had been adopted and that they were being left out of the nation, they quickly ratified it and joined the party, if you will, in this new republic.